In Job chapter 38, verses 22 through 24, I'll begin by reading our passage. I may, if some are able and willing to read for us, I may ask you to do so. Along the way, we're going to do this kind of as a class setting. If you have a question or comment, feel free to interject when it is an appropriate time. In Job chapter 38, 22 through 24, God is speaking to Job, and he says, "Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth?" I have three major guiding principles for us to consider as we look at these few verses, but really, without being in a systematic study of Job, it is necessary to always go back and remind ourselves of what is going on. And so we're considering the setting of this passage in the midst of the whole context of the book of Job. Many of you are familiar with Job as we read the introduction to him in chapters 1 and 2 of being an upright man, a man who was desired to do all that was right according to God's will, even so trying to lead his family and making sacrifice for them, even if perchance they might have sinned. I believe that Job certainly lived under the patriarchal era, that is, before the law of Moses came into effect. Very likely sometime between Noah and Abraham, somewhere in that time period. And I believe that the book of Job is the earliest writing that we have. I will not be dogmatic in any shape or form. However, I will be dogmatic against those who try to make Job out to be some fairy tale that was written after Babylon. Job was a real man, and the book of Job is so tremendously revealing concerning Jehovah. Some have said that the book of Job is not about Job as much as it is about our God, and how that God shows us his divine wisdom, and that our relationship with him, even the most righteous among us, the most wealthy among us, the most blessed among us, the strongest among us, that we are to rely completely upon God, his will, and his revelation, and to remember that the adversary wants nothing good for us, and everything that the adversary does is to our detriment. And yet he, that is Satan, is not all powerful. He's not all knowing. He's not omnipresent as God is. In fact, continually we see that he is the opposite of those things. He is very limited, but yet for the purpose of God, leaving us a superior example of one who suffered in every way that we suffer, and really suffered more than we will ever suffer because of God's special allowance and authority that he granted Satan on this one occasion. He gave Satan power to do something that Satan does not have today, and that was to directly affect Job and to cause the turmoil and the tragedy that happened in his life within such a short span of time. We know that Job, who was extremely wealthy and blessed and an upright and righteous man, would lose everything in matter of moments. He would lose all 10 of his children. He would lose his possessions, those things that would be considered his wealth, and what he provided used to provide for his family and to provide for many who were not as well off. Because as you read through Job, you get the idea that Job was a very generous man. that Job was that he was not in any shape or form stingy or greedy with the wealth with which he had been blessed. He would lose that wealth. He would lose his children. He would eventually lose his health. And Satan was trying in every way to get Job to turn away from God. Job would never turn from God. He never turns from God. That does not mean that he was perfect in every response that he would have. And so, as you see there in Job 3 through 37, as you continue to read, you read this the words of Job. You will read the words of his friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and you have these conversations back and forth. These three so-called friends had a noble and respectful or commendable cause in the beginning of coming to be with Job, but then they open their mouths, and on we see them trying to figure out what is wrong with Job. What has Job done wrong to cause this to happen to him? And the conclusion is that he's not done anything wrong, but they don't believe that. They believe that he must have sinned in some way to cause these events to happen in his life, and that simply was not true. But in the course of this, of them accusing him and Job defending himself over and over again, Job is going to grow weary of this, and to the point of even perhaps speaking some things, saying some things toward God that he should not, or thinking some things toward God that he should not, having some questions. The book of Job, again, is tremendous. You find questions throughout the book of Job that many have today. While this is the oldest writing that we have, it is still relevant. Many want to see the scriptures as archaic and antiquated and something that is not relevant. But the book of Job stands the test of time, dealing with the problem of suffering, dealing with the nature of our God and his righteousness and his justice, dealing with our inability to be in control and to guide the way that the world works. It seems that Job, in his righteousness, perhaps had become prideful. And so we have what I've called our second principle here, the sledding, where Job goes downhill. And with his the words that he would speak toward God, and just a few to highlight here in Job 31, verses 35 through 37. Who will read that for us? Job 31, 35 through 37.
I'll read it.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here's my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him.
Thank you, sir. Job maintains that he's done nothing wrong, which is true. He's done nothing wrong to cause these things to happen. And in his limited knowledge, the best conclusion that he can come to is that God has caused these things to happen to him, because from, again, his limited knowledge, God is the only one that has the power to do the things that have happened to him, except he did not know at the time that God had allowed Satan to have this ability to cause these things to happen to him, so that God could show the faithfulness of Job, so that God could show who he is, that he is all powerful, and that Satan is not all powerful, and that we as a people, in the midst of any suffering that we endure in this life, that we can remain faithful as well. Here, Job is crying out that God would answer him, that God would speak to him, and that he would give an account before God. Again, Job has done no wrong as far as to cause these things to happen. But to then get to the point, because of all of this discourse, this trouble, this affliction that has come about in the conversation with his friends, he begins to get a little prideful, a little presumptuous, if you will, about um, demanding that God answer him and that he be able to give an account before God and show his cleanliness before God. And God's going to answer him, and answer him perhaps the way that he does not expect. The question that there's a lesson here time and again for us, because so many in the world today um, think that God should do things the way that they want him to do them. They want to essentially make big G God, Jehovah, into little g God, and that he do everything that benefits them and never do anything or allow anything that would hinder them. And if ever God allows something, some suffering, some harm to come their way, then he must not be an upright and just God. And when we do that, we put ourselves into the position of God, and it is a very dangerous and a blasphemous place to be. And so in chapter 32 and verse 2, I just wanted to note here, in the midst of the introduction of one named Elihu, who would speak through chapters 32 through 37. And Elihu would have some good things to say and some logical things to say before God will speak. But he says, he notes here that his wrath was kindled against Job because he justified himself rather than God, that Job justified himself rather than God. That's not where Job began in this process. He began with praising God, even and worshiping God, even though these things had happened to him. But through the course of time, he had become weary, he had become impatient, he had become um, perhaps even prideful, in wondering why has this happened to me. And so God will answer him in a number of ways, in which I've called the settling. Job chapter 38 there, verses 1 through 3, just an introduction to where God begins to speak to Job. Then the Lord Jehovah answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. So Job has pleaded with God to answer him, and God's going to answer him, and God's going to ask him a series of questions, more than 70 questions, I believe it is, that are revealing, and they are helping Job to realize that not everything's about Job, and that there is a lot more going on in the world and in the universe than even what Job has going on. And God has not forgotten about him one bit whatsoever. And so, and you see through what God would bring up in chapters 38 all the way through chapter 42, he will bring out how that he is the creator of the world. He's laid the foundations of the earth. And he will bring out details and beautiful things concerning the oceans, concerning the precipitation, and which is something that we'll even consider here. And there are actually beautiful pictures and illustrations that God uses, and powerful illustrations God uses throughout this to convey himself to Job. Eventually, he will get into asking Job about even who cares for all of the creatures that in the world that have been created, the animal kingdom he will look to. And he will even zoom in on two particular parts of the animal kingdom, that being the behemoth and Leviathan, before Job will admit his wrongdoing, that he's spoken without knowledge, as we see there in chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Job saying, uh, that's what God has said to him, and now Job is responding. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Because of all these things that God has revealed to him in what we consider Job 38 through 41, Job says, now not only do I hear you, but I also see you. Therefore I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. And as you continue to read, God will deal with the iniquity of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And you have also the blessing that God will do in the life of Job to restore to him twofold. And he is blessed beyond anything that he had before. He will have 10 more children, and so he has 20 in total, 10 that would be not still upon the earth, but still living. And so we see, I want us to kind of see the setting that we find these verses, the sledding of Job. That is, Job thought that he had more control than he did, but yet he was going downhill. I don't know about you. Some of you really enjoy sledding. The rest of my family enjoys sledding on these icy hills. I do not so much, because I know that when I get on that sled, I have no control. I have no control of where I'm going to go, and so I don't enjoy that. Well, Job thought he had a little more control than he realized. He did not have any control at all, and he was sledding downhill when he began to misspeak and ask some things of God that he should not, or demand some things of God that he should not. But those things are settled. But now, considering our verses at hand, verses 22 through 24 of chapter 38, God uses the illustration, if you will, of a farmer. In fact, when we studied the book of Job a few years ago and we got to this passage, I entitled it The Cultivator of the Climate. That is, God is the cultivator of the climate. You can see him as the founder of the earth. You can see him as the father of the oceans. You can see him as the parent of the precipitation. You can see him in these verses as the plumber of the storms, and so on. He uses a variety of illustrations to relate to Job all that is within his power and within his oversight. And so this particular one, verses 22 through 24, he will use the illustration of a farmer who will prepare a storehouse, a treasury, as we have it in the King James. Hast thou entered into the treasures or treasuries of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures or treasuries of hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By that, what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Perhaps even venturing into another subject in verse 24 there. But you have this illustration of a farmer who would prepare his crops and other things, and he's going to store up some of that. He's going to put it into a treasury storehouse. In the Greek translation of Job, you have that same word that we have in the New Testament for the treasury of the church. That is where we lay by in store. It's the word from which we get our English word, thesaurus. So you have a farmer which would store up things for the day of trouble, the day when winter comes, when the snow and hail come. But God is saying that he is the farmer that has stored up the snow, and that he has stored up the hail, and for the days of trouble and against the day of the battle of war. And he's asking Job, have you been able to enter into my storehouses? Have you been able to enter into the places where snow and hail come from? And obviously the answer is no. He's not able to do that, and has not been able to do that even in all of our advancements in technology and the growth of knowledge that we've attained as mankind, we still cannot cause these things or be in control of these things the way that God is in control of these things. And so he says, which I have reserved against the time of trouble. You could consider occasions which God would actually use some of these forms and for battle or war or to show his power. For example, Exodus chapter 9. We've been studying in the book of Exodus. God would use as one of his plagues a severe hailstorm, including thunder and lightning and rain, a very severe storm on that occasion, in order to show his power and to teach the Egyptians and the Israelites who he is, and also to show his power over the gods of Egypt. And so, what are some things that we can take away from this, or some lessons that come to mind? First of all, is the lesson of control. That there's irony in that second point that I have there of Job's sledding, that Job thought he had more control than he did, and he needed to be reminded that God is in control. Who will read for us Psalm 135, verses 5 through 7? Psalm 135, verses 5 through 7.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
For I know that the Lord is great, and our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and in earth, in the seas and in all the deep places.
Thank you, sir. And we could consider a host of passages showing us God's power and control and oversight over his creation. In Daniel 4 and verse 32, you see there where we're told that the Most High reigns in the rules in the kingdoms of men and gives to whomsoever he will there during the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which reminds us in all the turmoil and all the tragedy that's taking place in our world and in our nation, that God ultimately is in control. I remember a few weeks ago reading a post made by Brother Billy Hayes. Some of you are familiar with him, and he noted how that he had seen something that he had not seen before in studying the account of the ark, and that was in the construction of the ark, God did not command Noah to put any form of rudder or steering mechanism in the ark whatsoever, which is a lesson and a beautiful picture of the fact that Noah was not in control of that vessel, but God was in control of that vessel. And as we think about our own lives, as I use the illustration of sledding, I don't like to not have control, but the reality is that I'm not in control in everything in my life. None of us are in control of everything that's taking place in our lives, even recent events being iced in and snowed in these recent days. We have to realize there's much that is not within our power and within our control, and that ventures even into the health of our mindsets and our mental health, and not worrying about things over which we have no control. I think about also the lesson of cultivation, and that comes as God would reveal to Job and remind Job that he is the cultivator of the climate, that he is the one who is in control of everything that happens in creation, in that sense, that he is the designer of those things, and he has stored these things up as a farmer would do with his own crops for the day of trouble. The question comes, what are we cultivating in our lives? What are we producing, sowing and planting and producing in our lives as Christians? And obviously in Luke 8, verses 4 through 15. We'll not read through there at this time, but a needful reminder of a passage where Jesus would give the parable of the soils, or you might call it the parable of the sower, in which the sower sowed his seed and it fell upon 4 different types of soil. 3 of those initially receiving, 1 would reject it, but 3 would receive. But eventually we see that there was only 1 type of soil that would produce fruit with patience. And that's the type of soil that we want to have our hearts to have. And so we think about what Jesus would reveal there in that context of Luke chapter 8, that the seed is the word of God. And so we need to be not only sowing it into our own hearts, but also sowing it into the minds and hearts of others. And, when you think about the life of Job, his friends and his acquaintances constantly arguing with him and debating with him and trying to tell him that he's obviously done something wrong reminds me of the world in which we live, that we're constantly in contact with individuals, whether we know them or not, whether it be through a personal basis, the people we know on a personal basis, or the people that we hear in media forms and other things in the news and on our social media platforms, that constantly we are bombarded with things that tell us we're wrong, that tell us we've done something wrong, or that we need to do it differently, that we believe the wrong way, that we're living the wrong way, when we're striving, not perfectly, but we're striving to follow God's will. And certainly humanism and the modernist mindset is that our society decides what is right and wrong. Well, the life of Job and the text of Job reminds us that no, it is God who decides what is right and wrong, and who has revealed to us what is right and wrong. And so in Ephesians 6, 10 through 17, you have their reference to putting on the whole armor of God, how we prepare ourselves for the day of battle, going back to the terminology that God would use. We could also consider in verse 24 the mention of light in the east wind, and the consideration of what we are putting out before others, what others see in us, letting our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father, which is in heaven, Matthew 5 and verse 16. And so the lesson of control, the lesson of cultivation, but also the lesson of accumulation. What are we storing up in our lives? And what are we doing with what we are storing up in our lives? In being shut in our home this week, we've taken some time to try to declutter the house a little bit, declutter some closets that have been overlooked for a while. Well, spiritually, what are we accumulating? What are we storing in our lives? And 2 passages I'm going to ask if someone will read for us. First, Matthew 6, 19 through 21, and then 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. Who will get Matthew 6 for us?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor dust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Thank you, sir. Also, 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. Who will get that for us?
I got it.
Thank you.
Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life.
Thank you, sir. So, from Job, these few verses, we consider a lesson of control, that God is ultimately in control, and consider what we are cultivating in our lives, and then also what we are accumulating in our lives.